The winter of 1878 had teeth. It gnawed at the Dakota Territory with a ferocity that even old-timers hadn't seen in decades. The snow fell in thick, suffocating sheets, transforming the endless prairie into a white wasteland where sky and earth merged into one colorless void. The wind howled like a wounded animal, cutting through wool and leather as if they were paper, finding every gap in clothing, every weakness in shelter. Margaret Sullivan pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little against the cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. Her hands, once soft from years of tending house in Cincinnati, were now raw and cracked as she gripped the reins of their old mare. Bess. The wagon wheels creaked and groaned through the deepening snow, each rotation a struggle against nature's fury. "Mama, I'm cold," came the small voice from beneath the pile of quilts in the wagon bed. "I know, sweet pea, just a little longer." Margaret's voice carried more hope than certainty. She'd been saying those words for hours now, maybe days. Time had become meaningless in this white hell. 6-year-old Emma poked her head out from the blankets, her cherubic face pinched with cold, lips tinged blue despite Margaret's best efforts to keep her warm. The child's father would have known what to do. Thomas had always known what to do. But Thomas was 6 months in the ground, taken by the fever that swept through their homestead like wildfire, leaving Margaret with nothing but debts, a failing farm, and a daughter to protect. The plan had seemed sound enough when she'd set out 3 days ago. Reach Millbrook, the frontier town 40 miles west where her late husband's cousin had promised work at his dry goods store. 40 miles? It might as well have been 400 now. Bess stumbled, her hooves finding no purchase on the ice beneath the snow. The old mare had carried them faithfully since Ohio, but Margaret could feel her weakening with each labored step. The animal's breath came in great clouds of steam, her sides heaving with effort. "Please, Bess, just a little more," Margaret whispered, her own breath creating ice crystals on the wool scarf wrapped around her face. But the mare had given all she had, with a sound somewhere between a sigh and a groan. Bess's legs buckled. She went down slowly, almost gently, as if apologizing for her failure. The wagon tilted dangerously before settling at an angle in the snow. "No, no, no!" Margaret leaped from the driver's seat, sinking knee-deep in the drift beside the fallen animal. She tugged at the reins, pushed against Bess's shoulder, pleaded with her to rise. The mare's eyes, kind and patient, even in extremity, looked at her with what seemed like regret before they began to glaze over. Emma had climbed out of the wagon, her small form nearly swallowed by the storm. "Mama, what's wrong with Bess?" Margaret pulled her daughter close, shielding her from the sight of their faithful companion's final moments. Her mind raced through their options, finding none. They were lost, had been for hours. The landmarks she'd memorized, the twisted cottonwood, the creek crossing, the abandoned soddy, all had vanished beneath the relentless snow. Their food was gone save for a few pieces of hardtack, no shelter in sight, no hope of rescue in this storm. The wind picked up, driving ice crystals like needles into any exposed skin. Margaret knew what came next. She'd heard the stories. Pioneers found frozen in spring thaw, preserved like statues in their final moments. Children were always found in their mother's arms. She dragged what supplies she could from the wagon, the blankets, the buffalo robe Thomas had traded for 2 summers ago, the last of the hardtack. In the lee of the tilted wagon, she created a small shelter, wrapping Emma in every layer she could find. "Are we going to die, Mama?" Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, the way children spoke of death before they truly understood its permanence. Margaret's throat constricted. She pulled her daughter onto her lap, wrapping her own body around the small form. "No, sweet pea, Mama won't let anything happen to you." But as the hours passed and the storm's fury only intensified, Margaret felt her body beginning to betray her. The violent shivering had stopped. She knew that was bad. Her thoughts moved like molasses, thick and slow. Emma had gone quiet against her chest, and Margaret could barely feel if the child was still breathing. "Please," she whispered to any god that might be listening. Not my baby. Take me, but not her. The wind answered with renewed violence, tearing at their makeshift shelter. Margaret closed her eyes, pressing her lips to Emma's cold forehead. At least they would go together. At least Emma wouldn't be alone. Through the howling wind came another sound. Hoofbeats? No, impossible. Her mind was playing tricks, but there it was again. The distinctive rhythm of a horse moving through snow. Margaret tried to call out, but her voice was barely a croak. She waved one arm weakly, the movement pathetically small against the vast white landscape. The rider materialized from the storm like a ghost. At first, Margaret's sluggish mind couldn't process what she was seeing. The figure sat tall on a painted horse, wrapped in fur and leather, long black hair whipping in the wind despite being partially bound. As he drew closer, she could make out the distinctive features, the high cheekbones, the copper skin, the beaded decorations on his clothing. A Comanche warrior. Margaret's heart, already barely beating, seemed to stop entirely. She'd heard the stories from other settlers, the raids, the scalping, the things they did to white women and children. Part of her wondered if she'd already died. And this was some fevered last vision. The warrior dismounted in one fluid motion, approaching through the snow with the sure-footed grace of someone born to this land. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 winters, with intelligent dark eyes that took in the scene, the dead horse, the tilted wagon, the woman clutching her child. Margaret tried to shrink back, to shield Emma, but her frozen muscles wouldn't respond. The warrior knelt in the snow before them, close enough that she could see the frost on his eyelashes, smell the smoke and leather and horse that clung to him. He said something in his own language, the words soft and questioning. When she didn't respond, he switched to broken English. You die here. Child, die here. The truth of it, spoken so plainly, broke something in Margaret. The tears that came froze on her cheeks almost instantly. She looked at this man, this savage, as her world named him, and saw her last, impossible chance. Please, she managed to whisper. Then, louder, desperate, she forced out words that burned like acid in her throat. Take me, use me, whatever you want, just save my daughter. The warrior's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. He looked at her for a long moment, this white woman offering the only currency she thought a man would value, selling herself for her child's life. Then he stood, walked to his horse, and returned with a thick buffalo robe lined with rabbit fur. Without a word, he wrapped it around Margaret and Emma, his hands surprisingly gentle as he tucked the fur around them. The warmth was immediate, shocking after so much cold. Margaret stared at him, confused, still waiting for him to name his price, to take what she'd offered. Instead, he looked her in the eye and spoke in careful, deliberate English. You owe me nothing. Before she could process the words, he had scooped Emma into his arms, then helped Margaret to her feet. The painted horse stood patient as he lifted them both onto its back, Margaret clutching Emma while he walked beside them, leading them into the storm. The cave appeared through the swirling snow like a miracle carved from stone, set into a rocky outcropping that Margaret hadn't even noticed in the storm. Its entrance was partially concealed by overhanging ledges and drifted snow. The warrior led his horse inside without hesitation, clearly familiar with this shelter. The change from howling wind to relative quiet was so sudden it made Margaret's ears ring. She blinked in the dim light, gradually making out the cave's interior. It wasn't large, perhaps 20 feet deep and half as wide, but it was dry. More than that, she could see signs of preparation, stacked firewood against one wall, bundles wrapped in hide, and the remains of an old fire pit near the entrance, positioned to let smoke escape while keeping the wind out. The warrior helped them down from the horse, his touch impersonal but careful. Emma stirred in Margaret's arms, whimpering softly. The child's skin felt like ice, her small body barely responsive. Without wasting words, the man moved with practiced efficiency. He gathered kindling from his stores, producing a small leather pouch from his belonging. Margaret watched, transfixed despite her exhaustion, as he struck flint against steel, coaxing sparks onto dried moss and grass. The tiny flame that resulted seemed like magic in their frozen world. As the fire grew, fed by increasingly larger pieces of wood, warmth began to creep into the cave. The warrior hung the buffalo robe across the entrance, creating a barrier against the wind. The painted horse led to the back of the cave, stood placidly, apparently accustomed to such arrangements. "Give child." Margaret's arms tightened instinctively around Emma before she understood. The warrior had unpacked more furs, creating a bed near the fire. His expression remained neutral, patient, as he waited for her to decide whether to trust him. What choice did she have? Margaret's arms were so weak she could barely hold her daughter. She let him take Emma, watched as he wrapped the child in layers of fur with the same careful attention he'd shown to starting the fire. He pulled a water pouch from his supplies, warming it near the flames before trying to coax a few drops between Emma's blue lips. "She needs food," Margaret said, her voice hoarse. We ran out." The warrior nodded once, moving to another bundle. He produced strips of dried meat and a leather bag of what looked like ground meal. With economical movements, he set a small pot trade goods. She noticed, not native-made, near the fire and began making a thin gruel with water in the meal, adding torn pieces of meat. Margaret huddled close to the fire, feeling sensation return to her extremities in painful waves. Pins and needles became burning agony as circulation restored itself. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, not wanting to disturb Emma or appear weak before this strange savior. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the storm's muffled rage outside. Margaret studied the warrior from under her lashes, trying to reconcile the stories she'd heard with the man before her. He moved with quiet grace, every action purposeful. His clothes, she noticed now, showed careful maintenance: beautifully beaded leather shirt, leggings decorated with porcupine quills, a bone breastplate laid aside with his weapons. This was no savage, but a man who took pride in his appearance and possessions. When the gruel was ready, he brought it to Emma first, lifting the child's head gently and spooning small amounts into her mouth. Emma's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty. "Mama," she whispered. "I'm here, Sweet Pea. You're safe. This man is helping us." Emma's gaze shifted to the warrior, her child's curiosity overcoming fear. "Are you an Indian?" Margaret's breath caught, but the warrior's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. "Comanche," he said simply, continuing to feed her. "I'm Emma," the child announced with the fearless introduction of youth. "That's my mama. Her name is Margaret, but Papa called her Maggie. Papa's in heaven now." "Emma!" Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, from embarrassment or the fire. She couldn't tell. The warrior glanced at her. "I am called Soaring Eagle by my people. Whites call me Joseph." He said the Christian name with faint distaste, as if it sat uncomfortably on his tongue. Margaret didn't know what to say. Thank you seemed inadequate. Her offer from before, that desperate, shameful bargain, hung between them like a physical presence. She couldn't meet his eyes, focusing instead on Emma, who was showing more alertness as warmth and food did their work. When Emma had eaten what she could, Joseph, she'd think of him by the white name, it seemed safer somehow, turned his attention to Margaret. He held out the pot with its remaining contents. "You eat." "I'm fine. Save it for you eat." His tone brooked no argument. "Cannot care for child if you die." The practicality of it struck her. She accepted the pot, the warmth of it painful against her still cold hands. The gruel was simple, cornmeal and meat, but it tasted like the finest meal she'd ever eaten. She tried to eat slowly, mannerly, but hunger won and she found herself scraping the pot clean with her fingers. Joseph had moved back to his supplies, returning with a bundle of dried herbs. He crushed some between his palms, adding them to water heating in another vessel. The smell was unfamiliar but not unpleasant, earthy and slightly bitter. "Medicine," he explained, seeing her watchful look, for warmth inside. When the tea was ready, he gave cups to both Margaret and Emma. The child made a face at the taste, but drank obediently when Margaret encouraged her. The liquid spread heat through Margaret's chest, seeming to reach places the external fire couldn't touch. Emma, with the resilience of childhood, was already recovering. She sat up in her fur cocoon, looking around the cave with bright interest. "Do you live here?" she asked Joseph. "Sometimes. When hunting. When storm comes." He had settled cross-legged near the fire, close enough to tend it but maintaining a respectful distance from them. "Why were you out in the storm?" "Emma, don't pester." Joseph held up a hand. "Is good she talks, means strength returns." He looked at the child. "I checked trap lines. See storm worse than expected. Come here, find you." Margaret wondered at the coincidence of it. What were the chances of him being exactly where they needed him? She thought of her desperate prayer in the snow and shivered despite the warmth. "My papa knew about trapping," Emma informed him. "He caught rabbits and sometimes deer, but then he got sick and went to heaven. Mama says he watches over us. Perhaps he sent me," Joseph said quietly. The simple statement hit Margaret like a physical blow. She turned away, overwhelmed by sudden emotion, the terror of the storm, the certainty of death, the shame of what she'd offered, the unexpected salvation. It all crashed over her at once. "Your mother is tired," Joseph said to Emma. "Should rest now." He prepared sleeping places for them, layering furs to create warm beds. The cave had warmed considerably, the fire's heat trapped by the buffalo hide entrance covering. Margaret helped Emma settle into the furs, the child already drowsy again despite her brief energy. "Mama, are we going to stay here?" "Just until the storm passes, sweet pea." "I like it here. It's warm, and Joseph is nice." Margaret smoothed her daughter's hair, from the mouths of babes. This Comanche warrior had shown them more kindness in a few hours than many of their own people had since Thomas's death. The banker who'd threatened foreclosure, the townspeople who'd whispered about the young widow, the men who'd looked at her like prey. She became aware of Joseph watching her. When their eyes met, she saw something she didn't expect, understanding, as if he could read the thoughts written on her face. "You sleep," he said. "I keep watch." The storm will last through night, maybe tomorrow too. You safe here." Margaret wanted to say something about payment, about debts, about how she could repay his kindness. But his earlier words echoed. "You owe me nothing." Instead, she asked, "Why? Why help us?" Joseph was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. He fed another piece of wood to the fire, the flames casting moving shadows across his angular features. "Long ago," he finally said, his English careful and measured. "Soldiers come to my village. Winter, like now. My people had little. We're peaceful. Soldiers want us moved to reservation. My father say we need time, wait for spring. Soldiers no wait." He paused, and Margaret could see memory moving behind his eyes like storm clouds. "They shoot. Women, children, old ones. My mother pushed me in storage pit, cover with hides. I hear everything, smell smoke. When quiet comes, I climb out, all dead, all burned. I was 10 winters." Margaret's hand had gone to her throat. "I'm so sorry." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "You think because I am Comanche, I take what you offer? Think I am like soldiers who take because they can?" Shame burned hot in Margaret's cheeks. I was desperate. Emma is everything to me." "Know this feeling. Is why I help, not for trade, not for owing, because is right thing." The fire popped, sending sparks up toward the cave's natural chimney. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the world. But inside, the three of them existed in a bubble of warmth and temporary safety. Margaret lay down beside Emma, her body finally warm for the first time in days. She watched Joseph through heavy eyelids as he tended the fire, checked his weapons, looked after his horse. Every movement spoke of competence, of a man at home in this harsh land that seemed determined to kill her and her daughter. "Joseph?" she said softly. Hmm. Thank you. He nodded once, then turned his attention back to the fire. Margaret let exhaustion claim her, feeling safer than she had since Thomas died. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was the warrior's profile against the firelight, standing guard against the storm and whatever other dangers the night might bring. The storm broke on the third day. Margaret woke to silence so complete it seemed louder than the wind had been. Pale sunlight filtered through the cave entrance where Joseph had pulled aside the buffalo hide, revealing a world transformed. The prairie stretched endlessly white, sculptured by wind into fantastic shapes, beautiful and terrible in its purity. Emma was already awake, sitting near Joseph as he prepared their morning meal. The child chattered happily, having appointed herself his assistant, carefully arranging strips of dried meat on a flat stone. The easy companionship between them made Margaret's chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. "The snow is too deep for walking," Joseph said when he noticed she was awake. "Must wait for sun to settle it. 2, maybe 3 days." Margaret nodded, though the prospect of remaining in this intimate shelter made her nervous. Not from fear that had passed, but from something more complicated. The careful distance she'd maintained, the social boundaries that defined her world, seemed meaningless here. "I need to reach Millbrook," she said. "My husband's cousin expects us." Joseph studied the landscape. "Millbrook is there." He pointed southwest. "1-day ride when snow allows. But your wagon?" He shook his head. The wagon was buried, useless now even if they could dig it out. Everything Margaret owned in the world was in that wagon or on their backs. She pushed down the despair that threatened to rise. They were alive. That had to be enough. After their meal, Joseph fashioned snowshoes from willow branches and rawhide with swift efficiency. "Come," he said. "Need water from stream." Margaret watched Emma playing in the cave mouth, making snow angels under the bright sky. "I should stay with... She is safe. Cave is known only to me." He handed her the makeshift snowshoes. "You need learn to walk on snow. Cannot always depend on others." There was no judgment in his tone, just practical truth. Margaret strapped on the snowshoes awkwardly, following him from the cave. Her first steps were clumsy, but Joseph showed her how to lift her feet, how to distribute her weight. They moved slowly across the frozen landscape, the only sounds their breathing and the crunch of snow. The stream was 100 yards from the cave, marked by a line of cottonwoods. Joseph broke through the ice with a hatchet, filling water pouches. Margaret stood watching, struck by how different the world looked in daylight, beautiful but unforgiving, like the man beside her. "You know this land," she said. "Born here. Before soldiers, before settlers, before lines on maps." He straightened, scanning the horizon with eyes that missed nothing. "My people follow buffalo? Season to season. Now buffalo mostly gone. People on reservation. I am." He searched for the word. "Between. Why aren't you on the reservation?" His jaw tightened. "Cannot live in cage. Cannot watch my people forget who they are. So I hunt, trade, move like shadow. Some say I am renegade. Maybe true." They were walking back when they saw the riders. 5 men on horseback, dark shapes against the snow, moving along the valley below. Joseph's hand went immediately to Margaret's arm, pulling her behind a drift. "Trappers," he said quietly. "White men." Margaret could see them more clearly now, rough-looking men in fur coats, rifles across their saddles. They moved slowly, following what might have been the old trail, now invisible under snow. One of them must have said something funny because harsh laughter carried across the still air. "Will they find the cave?" she whispered. "No, but best they not see us." They waited, motionless, until the riders passed from view. Joseph's face had gone hard, watchful. Margaret realized with a chill that had nothing to do with cold how vulnerable they were. A white woman and child with a Comanche warrior. The stories people would tell, the assumptions they would make. Back at the cave, Emma ran to greet them, bubbling with excitement about the patterns Frost had made on the rocks. Joseph smiled at her enthusiasm, but Margaret saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept returning to the cave entrance. That afternoon, as Emma napped, Margaret found herself sitting beside Joseph as he worked on his weapons. He was restringing his bow, his fingers sure and practiced on the sinew. "Those men," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice her fears. "You worry what they think if they see us." It wasn't a question. Margaret looked at her hands, work-roughened but still pale against the dark fur of her borrowed robe. "People talk, they judge. A widow traveling with—" She couldn't finish. "With Savage?" His voice held bitter amusement. "I didn't mean, is what they would say, what you thought when you first saw me." Margaret's cheeks burned. It was true. In that moment of desperation, she'd seen only the color of his skin, the stories she'd been told, not the man. "I was wrong," she said quietly. "You're more civilized than most men I've known." Joseph tested the bow's draw. Civilization, white man's word, means taking what is not yours and calling it law, means killing for land and calling it destiny. Not all of us believe that. No. He looked at her directly. "Your husband. He came west for land, yes? Land that was here before him. Will be here after. Land my people hunted for generations." Margaret wanted to protest, to defend Thomas's dream of a better life. But wasn't there truth in Joseph's words? They'd claimed 160 acres under the Homestead Act, land the government said was empty, but which had clearly been used by others before them. "I don't know how to answer that," she admitted. "Is honest answer?" He returned to his bow. "Your husband, he was good man?" "Yes." The word came immediately. "Kind, worked hard, loved Emma more than life. Then I'm sorry for your loss." They sat in companionable silence. Emma woke and came to sit between them, leaning against Margaret while watching Joseph work. "Are you married?" the child asked with characteristic directness. "Emma!" Margaret was mortified. Joseph's hand stilled on the bow. She died. Soldier's sickness." He meant smallpox. Margaret realized. The disease that had devastated native populations. "Do you have children?" Emma pressed on. "Immune to adult discomfort." "No. She died before children come." "That's sad. You'd be a good papa. You're patient like my papa was." Joseph looked at the child with something soft in his eyes. "You honor me." As evening approached, he prepared their meal while Margaret told Emma stories. She was halfway through a tale about a princess in a tower when Emma interrupted. "That's silly. Mama, why doesn't she just climb down herself?" Joseph made a sound that might have been suppressed laughter. "Smart girl," he said. "Why wait for rescue when can rescue self?" Margaret found herself smiling. "Maybe you're right. Maybe she should save herself. Tell story of woman warrior instead." Emma demanded, "Like Joseph, but a lady." So Margaret invented a tale of a brave woman who learned to hunt and fight to protect her children, who faced storms and dangers but never gave up. She caught Joseph watching her during the telling, something unreadable in his expression. That night, after Emma slept, they sat by the dying fire. Tomorrow or the next day they would leave this shelter, return to a world where their very association was scandalous at best, dangerous at worst. "What will you do in Millbrook?" Joseph asked. "Work in my husband's cousin's store, find rooms to rent, try to make a life for Emma. And if cousin says no, if work is gone," Margaret hadn't let herself think about that possibility, "then I'll find something else. I can sew, cook, take in washing, whatever it takes." "You are strong, like woman in your story." "I don't feel strong. Most days I feel like I'm barely holding on. Strength is not in feeling, is in doing what must be done." A log shifted in the fire, sending up sparks. Margaret pulled her borrowed robe closer. These furs, this warmth, this strange sanctuary, all would end soon. "Where will you go?" she asked. "South, maybe, winter hunting grounds, or west to mountains. Wherever wind takes me." The loneliness in that statement was profound. A man between worlds, welcome in neither, carrying his grief and his freedom like twin burdens. "That's no life," she said softly. "Is only life I have." They watched the fire die to embers. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars visible through the cave mouth like scattered diamonds. Margaret thought about the journey ahead, the challenges waiting in Millbrook, the weight of other people's judgment. "Joseph," she said suddenly, "when we leave here, if people see us together, I take you close to town, not in safer for you. That's not fair to you." He shrugged. "Fair is word for children. World is not fair, is only what is." Margaret wanted to protest, to say she didn't care what people thought. But that would be a lie. She had Emma to think of, a reputation to maintain if she hoped to make a life in Millbrook. The unfairness of it burned in her chest. "I wish," she started, then stopped. "What you wish?" "I wish the world was different. I wish good men were judged by their actions, not their birth. I wish—" She couldn't finish, couldn't voice the confused feelings that had grown in this small cave. Joseph reached over and added the last piece of wood to the fire. "My people say wishes are like smoke. They rise to sky but cannot be held. Better to work with what is." Margaret nodded, throat tight. Tomorrow they would leave. Tomorrow the world would intrude again with all its rules and prejudices. But tonight, in this space between storms, they were just three souls who had found each other in the vast wilderness. It had to be enough. She rose to check on Emma one last time before sleep. The child had kicked off her furs, and Margaret tucked them back around her. When she turned, Joseph was watching her with eyes that held understanding and something else, something that would follow her into dreams and beyond. "Sleep well, Margaret," he said, using her name for the first time. "Good night, Joseph." The fire burned low, casting long shadows on the cave walls. Outside, the land slept under its blanket of snow. And for these last hours, the world was simple and clean and possible. Millbrook appeared on the horizon like a collection of weathered wooden blocks scattered across the prairie. Smoke rose from chimneys into the clear winter sky, and Margaret could make out the main street, the church steeple, the cluster of businesses that made up the frontier town's heart. Her stomach clenched with a nervous anticipation. Joseph had stopped his horse on a small rise 1/2 mile from town. The painted pony shifted restlessly, sensing perhaps its rider's unease. They had traveled since dawn, Emma riding with Joseph while Margaret walked alongside, gradually finding her rhythm on the snowshoes he'd made for her. "This is far enough," Joseph said, helping Emma down from the horse. The child immediately protested. "But you have to come with us. You have to meet Cousin Frederick." Margaret placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Joseph has his own path to follow. Sweet pea." Emma's face crumpled. She threw her arms around Joseph's legs, burying her face against his leather leggings. "But I don't want you to go." Joseph knelt in the snow, bringing himself to the child's level. From his pack, he pulled out a small carved wooden horse, its details exquisite despite its tiny size. "This is for you. When you feel scared or alone, hold it. Remember, you are brave." Emma clutched the horse to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "Will I ever see you again? Perhaps. World has strange ways." Margaret had to look away from the tenderness in his face. These past days had shown her a man so different from everything she'd been taught to expect. The approaching separation sat like a stone in her chest. "Emma, go look at those rabbit tracks," she said softly. "Just there, by that bush." The child reluctantly obeyed, giving Margaret a moment alone with Joseph. They stood facing each other in the bright morning, breath misting in the cold air. "I don't know how to thank you," she began. "No thanks needed. You remember, you owe nothing, but I do. I owe you our lives. I owe you—" She stopped, unsure how to express the debt that went beyond mere survival. Joseph reached into his pack again, pulling out a small leather pouch. "Herbs. For sickness. For strength. Woman at edge of town. Mrs. Searching Crow, married to white man, but she is Cherokee. She will know their use. Find her if you need help. Margaret took the pouch, their fingers brushing in the exchange. Why are you telling me this? Town can be a hard place for women alone. Good to know where friends might be found. Friends? Is that what they were? The words seemed both too much and not enough for what had passed between them in the cave's shelter. Be careful, Joseph. Those trappers we saw? I am always careful. He paused, seeming to wrestle with words. Your husband was fortunate man. Before Margaret could respond, Emma had returned, still clutching her wooden horse. Joseph mounted his pony in one fluid motion, looking down at them from its back, against the winter sky. He seemed both part of the landscape and apart from it, a figure from an older world. Goodbye, little warrior, he said to Emma. Then, to Margaret, be strong. He turned the horse and rode away without looking back, figure growing smaller against the vast white prairie until he vanished into a fold in the land. Margaret stood watching long after he'd disappeared, Emma's hand in hers. Come, she finally said. Let's go meet Cousin Frederick. The walk to town seemed longer than the miles they'd traveled with Joseph. Each step brought them closer to civilization and further from the strange, protected world of the cave. Margaret tried to smooth her appearance, but she knew she looked like what she was, a woman who'd survived a blizzard and spent days in the wilderness. The first people they encountered were two women coming from the general store. They took one look at Margaret's borrowed Indian robe, at her weather-beaten appearance, and hurried past with averted eyes and whispered comments. Margaret lifted her chin and kept walking. Frederick Sullivan's dry goods store sat on Main Street between the barber shop and the land office. The painted sign reading, Sullivan's Goods, Fair Prices, Quality Wares, had been her beacon of hope for weeks. Now, standing before it, she felt her courage falter. Is this Cousin Frederick's store? Emma asked. Yes, Sweet Pea. Remember your manners now. The bell above the door jangled as they entered. The store was well stocked. Shelves lined with bolts of fabric, tools, canned goods, and the 1,000 necessities of frontier life. Behind the counter stood a man in his 40s, thin and sharp-featured, wearing a shopkeeper's apron over his suit. Frederick Sullivan looked up from his ledger, and Margaret watched recognition dawn in his eyes, followed quickly by something else. Dismay? Embarrassment? He came around the counter, stopping several feet from them as if their condition might be contagious. Margaret? Good Lord. What? How did you? His gaze traveled from her tangled hair to her Indian robe to Emma's equally disheveled state. Hello, Frederick. We've had a difficult journey. As I wrote in my letter, we're hoping to… Yes, the letter. He glanced toward the store windows where she could see faces peering in. Perhaps we should speak in the back room. He ushered them through a curtained doorway into a storage area that smelled of pickle brine and leather. Once away from public view, his manner became more businesslike, though no warmer. I'm sorry for your loss. Of course, Thomas. Well, he was family. The words seemed to cost him effort. But Margaret, I must be frank. When I offered help, I assumed you'd arrive in different circumstances. We were caught in the blizzard. We lost everything. If not for… She stopped, instinctively knowing that mentioning Joseph would only make things worse. Yes, well, Frederick fidgeted with his watch chain. The thing is, I've already hired someone for the store. Last week, a widow from town, very respectable. And as for lodgings, my wife, that is, we don't have room. Margaret felt the floor shifting beneath her feet. But your letter said… I know what it said, but that was before. Margaret, you must understand. Arriving like this, wearing savage clothing, looking like… Well, people are already talking. I have a business to run, a reputation to maintain. Mama? Emma's voice was small, confused. Frederick's gaze barely touched the child. There's a boarding house on 3rd Street, Mrs. Prudhomme's. She might have a room. As for work… He pulled out his wallet, extracted several bills. This should help until you can make other arrangements. Perhaps in another town. Margaret stared at the money charity. Dismissal. 30 pieces of silver all at once. Pride warred with necessity. Emma needed food, shelter, warmth. She took the bills. "Thank you for your generosity," she said, voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. They left through the back door at Frederick's suggestion. To avoid further gossip, Margaret held Emma's hand tightly as they walked down the alley. Emerging onto 3rd Street, Mrs. Prudholme's boarding house for respectable ladies had seen better days. Paint peeled from its clapboard sides, and the front steps sagged with age. The woman who answered Margaret's knock was thin and severe, with eyes that took in every detail of their appearance. "I don't take in irregular boarders," she said before Margaret could speak. "Please, I have money, just for a few nights until I can find work." Mrs. Prudholme's gaze lingered on the Indian robe. "Where's your husband?" "Dead. 6 months now." "And you've been living with Indians since?" The accusation was clear. "No, we were traveling. The storm. I run a Christian establishment. I don't need trouble or scandal. Try the Dogwood Saloon. They rent rooms by the hour." The door slammed shut. Margaret stood on the steps. Emma pressed against her side, feeling the weight of every stare from passing townspeople. The wooden horse Joseph had carved dug into her palm where Emma clutched her hand. They tried 2 more boarding houses with similar results. By afternoon, exhaustion and hunger made Emma whimper with each step. Margaret used some of Frederick's money to buy bread and cheese from the general store, enduring the proprietor's suspicious glare and inflated prices. They ate sitting on a bench outside the church, watching the town go about its business. Men tipped their hats to ladies who passed. Children played in the muddy snow. Life continued in its orderly fashion, but for Margaret and Emma, wrapped in their Indian robe and marked by their ordeal, there seemed to be no place in this order. "Mama, why won't anyone help us?" Emma asked. How could she explain prejudice to a 6-year-old? How could she describe the invisible lines that separated acceptable from unacceptable? The way appearance mattered more than character. "They're afraid," she said finally, "of things they don't understand. Joseph wasn't afraid of us. No, he wasn't." As the sun began to sink, desperation crept in. They couldn't sleep in the streets. Margaret was contemplating the unthinkable, approaching the saloon the boarding house woman had mentioned when she remembered Joseph's words. The Cherokee woman at the edge of town. They found the small house after asking several people, most of whom responded with warnings or disapproval. It sat apart from the other buildings, neat but clearly marked as different by the herbs drying under the eaves and the symbols painted on the doorframe. A woman answered Margaret's knock, perhaps 50, with silver threading through her black hair and intelligent dark eyes that reminded Margaret painfully of Joseph. "Mrs. Searching Crow," the woman studied them. "You are the ones who came with Soaring Eagle." Margaret's breath caught. "How did you know?" A slight smile. "Wind carries stories. Also, you wear his robe." She stepped aside. "Come, you are welcome here." The inside of the house was warm and clean, smelling of sage and cooking food. An older white man sat by the fire, pipe in hand. He nodded pleasantly at their entrance. "My husband, Robert Crow," the woman said. "I am Mary. Sit, you are hungry." It wasn't a question. Mary bustled about, setting bowls of stew before them, thick with meat and vegetables. Emma ate ravenously while Margaret fought tears of gratitude. "The town," Margaret began. "The town sees what it expects to see," Robert said. His voice carried a Scottish burr. "I've lived here 20 years, married to Mary for 15, and they still cross the street when they see us coming." "But you stay." Mary and Robert exchanged glances. "Where else would we go?" Mary asked. "This is home. Let them whisper. We know who we are." After Emma had eaten, Mary showed them to a small, clean room. "You stay tonight. Tomorrow, we talk about what comes next." Margaret tried to protest, to offer payment, but Mary waved her away. "Soaring Eagle saved you. That makes you family to all who know him. Rest now." Alone with Emma in the first real bed they'd seen in a week, Margaret held her daughter close and thought about the day. The rejection, the humiliation, the unexpected haven found in the home of outcasts. Through the window, she could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, Joseph traveled his lonely path. "Mama," Emma said sleepily, "I miss Joseph." "I know, sweet pea, so do I." And in the darkness of this strange room, in this unwelcoming town, Margaret finally admitted to herself the truth she'd been avoiding. She missed him with an ache that went beyond gratitude, beyond friendship. Missed his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, the way he'd looked at her across the fire's glow. But he was gone, and she was here. And tomorrow she would have to find a way to build a life in a place that had already judged and found her wanting. She pressed her lips to Emma's hair and closed her eyes, trying not to think about how cold the world seemed without a Comanche warrior's protection. The whispers started as ripples and became waves. Within a week of their arrival, Margaret couldn't walk down Main Street without feeling the weight of eyes and hearing the rustle of gossip in her wake. The story had grown in the telling, as stories do in small towns starved for scandal. She lived with savages, they said, shared their blankets, if you know what I mean. That poor child, exposed to such degradation. No decent woman would accept such help. Margaret learned to shop early in the morning when fewer people were about. She kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, and tried to shield Emma from the worst of it. But children had their own cruel ways. "Half-breed bastard." The taunt came from a group of boys outside the schoolhouse where Margaret had hoped to enroll Emma. Clods of muddy snow followed the words. Emma didn't understand the words but felt their venom. She pressed closer to Margaret's side, small fingers clutching the wooden horse that never left her possession. "Pay them no mind," Margaret said, though her own hands shook with anger. "They're just ignorant children." But it wasn't just children. The minister's wife crossed the street rather than meet them. The banker's look of distaste when she tried to inquire about her late husband's account. The shopkeepers who suddenly had no work available, no rooms to rent, no place for a woman who'd been compromised. Mary Crow became their lifeline. She took in washing and mending, sharing the work and the meager profits with Margaret. It wasn't enough to live on, barely enough to contribute to their keep, but it was something. "You could leave," Mary suggested one evening as they worked by lamplight, fingers busy with needle and thread. "Other towns might not know your story." Margaret considered it daily, but leaving required money they didn't have, and the thought of arriving somewhere else as desperate as they'd arrived here made her stomach clench. Besides, running felt like admitting guilt for something that wasn't shameful, accepting help from a good man whose only crime was being born Comanche. The breaking point came 3 weeks after their arrival. Margaret had ventured to the general store for thread, Emma waiting outside. When she emerged, she found her daughter surrounded by a group of women, including the minister's wife, Mrs. Abigail Whitman. "Such a shame. Mrs." Whitman was saying, loud enough to carry, "to expose an innocent child to such moral corruption. Why, she probably witnessed all manner of heathen behavior. I've heard they sleep naked," another woman added with delicious horror, "and share their women like animals." Emma's face was red, tears threatening. She understood enough to know they were talking about Joseph, about her. "Excuse me," Margaret said, her voice deadly quiet. She pushed through the circle to reach Emma. "Mrs." Whitman drew her skirts aside as if contamination might spread. "Mrs. Sullivan, we were just expressing our concern for your daughter's welfare." "How Christian of you." Margaret's control snapped. "Tell me, Mrs. Whitman, where was your concern when we were freezing to death in a blizzard? Where was your charity when we arrived seeking help? A heathen saved our lives while good Christian folk turned their backs." Gasps rippled through the group. "Mrs." Whitman's face flushed purple. "How dare you compare decent people to savages? Everyone knows what Indian men do to white women. The fact that you defend him only proves..." "Proves what?" Margaret stepped closer. "That I'm grateful to be alive? That I judge men by their actions rather than their birth? Joseph, standing, soaring eagle, showed more honor and kindness than anyone in this self-righteous town. "You see, Mrs." Whitman addressed the crowd gathering around the confrontation. "She doesn't even deny it. She calls the savage by name, speaks of him with affection. No doubt she shared more than his fire." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret felt Emma trembling beside her, felt the weight of every eye, every judgment. She could deny it, could grovel and beg understanding, could throw Joseph's honor in the mud to save her own reputation. Instead, she lifted her chin. "I shared his protection, his kindness, his humanity. If that makes me fallen in your eyes, then I'll gladly fall again." She took Emma's hand and walked through the crowd, which parted like the Red Sea, not from respect, but from revulsion. Behind them, the whispers exploded into open speculation. That night, Robert Crow came home with troubling news. "There's talk of the town council. Some are saying you're a bad influence, that Emma should be removed for her own welfare." Margaret's blood ran cold. "They can't do that. They're good Christian folk." Robert's voice was bitter with irony. "They can do whatever they convince themselves is righteous." Emma had finally cried herself to sleep after the day's events. Margaret sat by her bed, watching her daughter's peaceful face, and felt fury rise in her chest. They could hurt her, shame her, drive her out, but she would not let them take her child. "What should I do?" she asked Mary. The older woman was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes, to protect what we love, we must choose battles we cannot win. But sometimes," she looked at her husband, a lifetime of shared defiance in that glance. "Sometimes we refuse to fight on their terms at all." The next day brought more harassment. Someone had painted "Injun Lover" on the side of Mary's house during the night. A rock sailed through the kitchen window as they ate breakfast, sending glass across the table. "Enough," Robert said, sweeping up the shards. "This has gone beyond gossip." But the sheriff, when summoned, merely shrugged. "Kids will be kids. Maybe if certain people didn't invite trouble." Margaret understood. The law, like everything else in Millbrook, was selective in its protection. That afternoon, while hanging washing in Mary's yard, Margaret heard horses approaching. Her body tensed, ready for more trouble. But Mary touched her arm. "Look," she said softly. 3 riders approached from the east, Indians, by their dress and bearing. As they drew closer, Margaret's heart leaped. She recognized the paint pattern on one of the horses. Joseph. He rode tall despite what must have been weeks of hard winter travel. Flanking him were 2 other Comanche warriors, their faces impassive as they took in the town's stunned reaction to their presence. They stopped at Mary's gate. Joseph's eyes found Margaret immediately, and something passed between them that made her knees weak, but his expression remained neutral as he dismounted. "Mrs. Crow," he said formally to Mary, though they clearly knew each other. "I come to trade, furs for supplies." It was an excuse, Margaret realized, an acceptable reason for his presence that might avoid bloodshed. But she saw the way his companions watched the street, hands near weapons. They expected trouble. "Joseph!" Emma had heard the horses and came flying from the house. She launched herself at him without hesitation, and he caught her, lifting her high. "Little warrior," he said, and his smile transformed his face. "You are well? I missed you so much. People here are mean. They say bad things about you and make Mama cry." Joseph's eyes found Margaret again. She saw the question there, the concern, and beneath it, something that made her pulse race. "Come inside," Mary said quickly. "All of you will discuss your trade where it's warm." But it was too late. People had gathered, drawn by the spectacle of Indians in town in broad daylight. Margaret recognized faces from yesterday's confrontation, including Mrs. Whitman, who looked ready to summon the cavalry. "See how she runs to him," someone muttered. "Shameless." So, in front of the child, Joseph heard it all. Margaret could tell by the tightening of his jaw. But he set Emma down gently and turned to face the crowd. "I come in peace," he said in clear English. To trade, nothing more. We don't trade with murdering savages. A man called out. One of Joseph's companions said something sharp in Comanche. Joseph replied without turning, his tone clearly warning restraint. The sheriff had arrived, hand resting on his pistol. You boys finish your business and move along. We don't want trouble. Neither do we, Joseph said. But this woman, he gestured to Margaret, is under my protection. The child also. Who brings them trouble? Brings it to me. The threat was implicit, but unmistakable. Margaret saw men exchanging glances, calculating odds. 3 Comanche warriors against a town, but how many more might be nearby? The frontier was full of stories about Indian vengeance. Misses. Whitman pushed forward, face twisted with righteous fury. You see, she is his woman. She admits it without shame. I am no man's woman, Margaret said, stepping forward. But yes, I am under his protection, as any decent man would protect a widow and child in need. Where was your protection, Mrs. Whitman? Where was your Christian charity? Don't you dare. I dare because I have nothing left to lose. You've taken my reputation, my peace, threatened my child. What more can you do? Joseph moved then, placing himself slightly between Margaret and the crowd. The gesture was protective but not possessive, a warrior guarding something precious. Perhaps, Robert Crow said into the tense silence, we should all remember that this is a day for trade, not conflict. Bad for business. Conflict. Some of the men nodded, torn between hostility and the practical consideration that Indian trade could be profitable. The crowd began to disperse, though whispers and dark looks remained. Inside Mary's house, Joseph's companions accepted coffee while maintaining watchful silence. Emma chatted happily to Joseph, showing him her attempts at carving her own wooden animals. Margaret wanted to speak with him privately, but didn't trust herself, not with the emotions churning inside her. The town gives you trouble. Joseph said, it wasn't a question. We manage. Margaret replied, managing is not living. Mary and Robert exchanged glances. Perhaps, Mary said carefully, we should speak of alternatives. One of Joseph's companions, he'd introduced himself as Black Wolf, spoke in accented English. Soaring Eagle speaks of you often, says you have courage. This is good, but courage alone does not feed children or stop hatred. What are you suggesting? Margaret asked. Joseph leaned forward. Come with us. The words hung in the air. Emma stopped chattering, looking between the adults with bright interest. To the reservation? Margaret's voice was faint. No. I know place, valley and mountains, good water, shelter. Others live there, my people, some Mexicans, even a few whites who seek peace. No one asks about past, only about character. A mixed community. Robert sounded interested. I've heard rumors of such places. Is real hard life but honest. No one judges by skin or past choices. Margaret's mind raced. Leave civilization entirely? Raise Emma outside the bounds of proper society? But what had proper society offered them except judgment and cruelty? I need time to think, she said. Joseph nodded. We trade. Rest horses. Leave tomorrow, sun high. You decide by then. That evening, the town's hostility escalated. A group of men, liquored and bold, gathered outside Mary's house, shouting threats and obscenities. Rocks struck the walls. Someone fired a gun into the air. Inside, Joseph and his companions checked their weapons with practiced calm. Robert loaded his old rifle while Mary comforted Emma, who clung to her wooden horse. This is my fault, Margaret said, sick with guilt. I've brought danger to your home. No, Mary said firmly. Ignorance and hatred brought danger. You brought only need for help, which we gladly gave. The shouting grew louder. Through the window, Margaret could see torches. Her decision crystallized in that moment. Stay and fight a battle that couldn't be won, risking Emma, risking these good people who'd sheltered them, or choose another path, uncertain but free from this poisonous judgment. She looked at Joseph, who waited with the patience of stone, and knew he'd already read her answer in her eyes. We'll come with you, she said quietly. Emma cheered. Mary smiled sadly but with understanding. Robert nodded approval. Outside, the mob grew louder, working up courage for violence. Inside, a small group of outcasts planned a dawn departure toward a different kind of life, one where character mattered more than convention, where survival depended on cooperation rather than conformity. Margaret held Emma close and met Joseph's steady gaze. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, surrounded by true friends and protected by men who judged her worth rather than her race or circumstances, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas died. Hope. The attack came at dawn, 2 days after they'd announced their intention to leave. Margaret woke to the sound of breaking glass and Emma's terrified scream. Fire already licked at the curtains where a torch had been thrown through the window. "Get Emma!" Mary shouted, throwing water on the flames while Robert grabbed his rifle. Joseph and his companions were already moving, weapons in hand. Black Wolf kicked open the back door, checking for attackers, while Joseph scooped Emma into his arms. "Stay low," he commanded Margaret, pushing her toward the door. Gunfire erupted outside. The mob had come prepared. Emboldened by liquor and righteous fury, Margaret could hear Sheriff Watson's voice among them, supposedly keeping order but making no effort to stop the violence. They stumbled into the pre-dawn darkness. The barn was already ablaze, horses screaming in terror. Swift Elk, Joseph's other companion, had managed to free most of them, but Mary's old milk cow was trapped. "Let it go!" Robert shouted, but Mary was already running toward the barn. More gunshots. A bullet splintered wood inches from Margaret's head. She saw Joseph push Emma behind a water trough, then spin and fire his rifle in one fluid motion. A man cried out and fell. "Murderers!" someone yelled. "The savages are killing white men!" It was the excuse they'd wanted. The mob surged forward, all pretense of justice abandoned. Margaret grabbed a pitchfork, ready to defend her daughter, but Joseph caught her arm. "Inside, now!" They retreated to the house, where Robert had overturned the heavy table for cover. Mary had saved her cow, but her arm was bleeding from a graze. The flames were controlled, but smoke filled the room. "How many?" Robert asked. 15, maybe 20, Black Wolf reported. "More coming." Through the broken window, Margaret could see townsmen taking positions. Some she recognized: the banker, the blacksmith, even Frederick Sullivan, her husband's cousin. Their faces were twisted with hate and excitement, the thrill of sanctioned violence. "We're going to burn you out," someone shouted. "Send out the savages and we might let the others live." "They want us," Joseph said quietly to Margaret. "If we go—" "No," her voice was steel. "We stand together or not at all." Emma whimpered from her hiding spot. Margaret crawled to her, gathering her close. "Be brave, sweet pea." Just like in the stories. "I want them to stop," Emma sobbed. "Why do they hate us?" Margaret had no answer that would make sense to a child. How could she explain that sometimes fear and ignorance crystallized into violence? That being different was crime enough in some people's eyes? The shooting intensified. Robert fired steadily from the window, his Scottish stubbornness in every shot. Mary reloaded weapons with bloody fingers. The Comanche warriors moved like ghosts, appearing at different windows, making the mob think they were more defenders than there were, but they were outnumbered and running low on ammunition. The mob grew bolder, creeping closer. Margaret heard someone splash kerosene on the walls. "They mean to burn us all," Mary said grimly. Joseph exchanged rapid words with his companions in Comanche. Then he turned to Margaret. "There is way out. Root cellar connects to Old Well. Comes up behind Smokehouse. We go now, while they watch front." "What about Mary and Robert?" The older couple exchanged glances. "This is our home," Robert said simply. "We'll hold them as long as we can. Give you time to get clear." "No," Margaret began, but Mary gripped her hand. "You have a child to think of. Go, live free. That's victory enough." There was no time to argue. Joseph led the way to the root cellar, Black Wolf carrying Emma while Swift Elk guarded their rear. The cellar was dark and musty. barely tall enough to stand upright, behind stacked preserves. Joseph revealed a narrow tunnel. I should have known Mary had secrets, Margaret murmured. They crawled through darkness, Emma clinging to Black Wolf's neck. The tunnel was old, probably dug during earlier Indian troubles. Dirt showered down with each explosion of gunfire above. They emerged behind the smokehouse as planned, but dawn was breaking. They'd be visible soon. Joseph's horse waited where Swift Elk had hidden it, along with 2 others they'd rescued from the barn. Take Emma, Joseph told Margaret. Ride hard for the eastern hills. We follow. Wait. But he was already moving, rifle raised. A shout went up from the mob. They'd been spotted. Margaret mounted clumsily, hauling Emma up in front of her. She'd barely ridden since leaving Ohio. Certainly never bareback on an Indian pony, but desperation was a powerful teacher. Hold tight, she told Emma, and kicked the horse into motion. They flew across the frozen ground, gunfire cracking behind them. Margaret didn't look back, focused only on staying mounted and protecting Emma. The horse seemed to sense their fear, stretching into a full gallop. A rider appeared on their right, Frederick Sullivan on his expensive bay gelding. He raised a pistol, face contorted with determination to stop the shame to his family name. Margaret yanked the reins left, nearly unseating them both. Frederick's shot went wide. He spurred closer, raising the gun again. An arrow sprouted from his shoulder. He screamed and fell from his horse. Swift Elk galloped past. Another arrow already knocked. They reached the hills as the sun fully rose. Joseph caught up, his face grim. Robert and Mary, Black Wolf shook his head. Margaret felt her heart tear. Those good people, killed for the crime of showing kindness. We can't stop, Joseph said, though she saw the pain in his eyes. They'll form a posse. Come. They rode through the morning, pushing the horses hard. Emma had gone silent, traumatized by the violence. Margaret held her close, murmuring reassurances she didn't feel. By noon, they'd put miles between them and Millbrook. Joseph called a halt by a stream to rest the horses. They had few supplies, whatever the warriors had carried, plus the clothes on their backs. I'm sorry, Margaret said to Joseph as they watered the horses. This is my fault. If I hadn't come to town, if I hadn't defended you publicly, you spoke truth. That is no fault. He looked back the way they'd come. Mary and Robert knew risk. They chose to stand for what is right. We honor them by living. Where will we go now? The valley I spoke of. 3 days' ride. If we push hard, posse will not follow so far. Too afraid of Indian territory. Emma had dismounted and stood by the stream, clutching her wooden horse. She hadn't spoken since they'd fled. Margaret went to her, kneeling in the cold grass. I know you're scared. Sweet Pea, I am too. They killed Mrs. Mary, Emma said in a tiny voice. And Mr. Robert, because of us? No, baby. They died because evil men couldn't bear to see kindness between different people. But they died brave, protecting us. We must be brave too, to make their sacrifice mean something. Emma looked at her with eyes too old for her years. Will it always be like this, running and hiding? Margaret glanced at Joseph, who watched them with unreadable eyes. I don't know, but we're alive. We're together, and we're going somewhere new. Sometimes that's all we can ask for. They rode through the afternoon, following paths only Joseph knew. The landscape changed from prairie to foothills, dotted with pine and juniper. No signs of pursuit, but they remained watchful. That night they camped without fire, sharing Joseph's dried meat and huddling together for warmth. Emma slept between Margaret and Black Wolf, who'd appointed himself her guardian. The warriors took turns on watch. Margaret couldn't sleep. The events of the day played repeatedly in her mind. The fire, the gunshots, Mary's blood, Robert's determined face. Good people dead because hatred was easier than understanding. You grieve, Joseph said quietly from where he sat on the watch. They saved us, took us in when no one else would. They understood what it means to be outside, like us. He gestured to his companions. Black Wolf's village destroyed when he was young. Swift Elk's family killed by buffalo soldiers. Me, you know. We are all orphans of different wars. Emma doesn't deserve this life. Running, violence, never belonging anywhere. Joseph was quiet for a moment. Belonging is not about place, is about people who accept you. In Valley, she will have that. And if they come for us there, then we fight, but on our ground, our terms. He looked at her directly. You regret coming? Margaret thought of Millbrook, of the whispers and threats, of the righteous hatred in familiar faces. No, I regret that kindness costs so much, that being human to each other is revolutionary act, has always been so. Your Bible tells of man killed for saying, love thy neighbor. The reference surprised her. You know the Bible? Mission school. When young, before I understood they wanted to kill the Indian to save the man. His voice held old bitterness. But some words were true. Love costs, but not loving costs more. They sat in companionable silence, watching stars wheel overhead. Despite everything, the loss, the fear, the uncertain future, Margaret felt a peace she hadn't known in months. Out here, stripped of society's pretenses, things seemed clearer. A man's worth wasn't in his skin color or his customs, but in his actions. Joseph had proven his worth a dozen times over. I want to learn, she said suddenly. To shoot, to ride properly, to survive out here. I won't be helpless burden. He almost smiled. You are far from helpless, but yes, I teach. Emma too. She must be strong for what comes. What does come? Joseph? Really? This valley? Is it real or just another dream that will turn to ashes? He considered before answering. Is real. Difficult. Isolated, but real. 30, maybe 40 people. Apache, Mexican, Comanche, some whites, all running from something, building something new. Not paradise, but honest. And they'll accept us? You stood against your own people for what is right. That speaks louder than words. Dawn was breaking, painting the mountains pink and gold. Soon they'd ride again, pushing toward this promise of sanctuary. Margaret looked at Emma's sleeping face, at the loyal warriors who'd risked everything for strangers, at the man whose quiet strength had become her anchor. They were outcasts, refugees, people without a country, but they were alive. They were together, and they were free, in a frontier that demanded conformity or death. That was its own revolution. Wake the others, Joseph said. Long day ahead. Margaret nodded, but paused before moving. Joseph? Whatever happens, I'm glad you found us in that storm. He looked at her, and for a moment his stoic mask slipped, revealing something warm and vulnerable beneath. So am I, Margaret Sullivan, so am I. Then the moment passed, and they were back to the business of survival, rousing companions and preparing for another day's flight toward an uncertain but chosen future. Behind them, smoke still rose from Millbrook, marking the end of one life and the desperate hope for another. The hidden valley revealed itself like a secret whispered by the mountains. After 3 days of hard riding through increasingly rugged terrain, they crested a narrow pass between towering peaks and saw it spread below, a green jewel cradled in stone, with a silver stream winding through its heart. Look, Mama! Emma pointed from her perch in front of Black Wolf. There are houses, real houses. Indeed there were. A scattered collection of dwellings that seemed to grow from the landscape itself. Some were adobe in the Mexican style, others log cabins, a few traditional Indian structures. Smoke rose from chimneys, and Margaret could see figures moving about their daily tasks, gardens being tended, livestock grazing. Is beautiful, she breathed. Joseph's face softened with something like pride. Yes, hidden from outside world, but good land. Water never fails, even in drought. Game plenty. Soil grows corn, beans, squash. They descended carefully, horses picking their way down a trail that would be invisible to unfamiliar eyes. As they approached the valley floor, a rider came to meet them, a Mexican man with silver in his hair and watchful eyes. Soaring Eagle, he called in accented English. You return with guests? With friends. Miguel, this is Margaret Sullivan and her daughter Emma. They come to stay, if the community accepts. Miguel studied them with interest, but no hostility. Any friend of yours is welcome to speak their case. Maria will be glad. She misses having children for her school. School? Margaret's heart lifted. Even here, in this remote sanctuary, they valued learning. The settlement was larger than it first appeared, perhaps 50 souls in all. People emerged from houses and workshops to see the newcomers. Apache women grinding corn. A white man with one arm working leather. Mexican children playing with Indian children in cheerful chaos. All watched with curiosity but not suspicion. Joseph led them to a central area where an old Apache man sat in the shade, clearly a figure of respect. Joseph dismounted and spoke to him in a mixture of languages, Apache, Spanish, English words mixing fluidly. This is Grandfather Torres, Joseph explained to Margaret. He speaks for the community when decisions must be made. The old man's eyes were clouded with age but sharp with intelligence. He studied Margaret and Emma for a long moment before speaking in careful English. You are the woman who stood with Soaring Eagle against her own people. I stood for what was right, Margaret said simply, and lost much for it. I lost nothing that mattered more than my daughter's life and my honor. He nodded slowly. The child, she understands our way here, all equal, all work, all protect each other. Emma, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. Joseph saved us. Black Wolf carried me when I was scared. Swift Elk taught me to whistle like a bird. They're my friends. A smile creased the old man's weathered face. From the mouths of children comes wisdom. You may stay. There is an empty cabin by the eastern garden. Roof needs work, but walls are sound. You will share in work and food. Acceptable. More than acceptable. Thank you. And just like that, they had a home. The cabin was small but sturdy, built by a German family who'd moved on the previous year. True to Grandfather Torres's word, the roof leaked, but the walls were solid logs, chinked tight against wind. There was a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft, even glass windows, luxury on the frontier. Women appeared as they surveyed their new home. Apache, Mexican, even a Negro woman who introduced herself as Sarah. Escaped from slavery in Texas years before. They brought blankets, cooking pots, dried food, all the necessities Margaret had lost. We help each other here, Sarah explained, helping Margaret sweep out dust and old leaves. Has to be that way, or we don't survive. Your girl, she'll go to Maria's school with the other children. You know any useful skills? I can sew, cook, tend garden. I'm learning to shoot. Sarah laughed. Good start. We'll teach you the rest. Preserve food for winter. Work leather. Maybe some healing arts if you've got the touch. Everyone does everything here. Emma had already made friends, running off with a pack of children to explore. Their easy acceptance of her warmed Margaret's heart. No one asked about her father or whispered about her circumstances. That evening, the community gathered for a shared meal. Long tables were set up in the central area, everyone contributing something. Margaret watched the easy mixing of races and cultures with wonder. An Apache woman joking with a white man, Mexican children learning words in Comanche, former slaves breaking bread with former soldiers. How does it work? She asked Maria, the school teacher. Outside, this would be impossible. Maria, an educated Mexican woman who'd fled an arranged marriage, smiled. Outside has luxury of hatred. Here, we need each other too much. First winter, Apache knowledge saved Mexican families from starving. White doctor saved Apache children from sickness. Negro blacksmith keeps all our tools working. Hate is expensive when survival is question. Joseph sat across from them. Emma beside him showing off the moccasins one of the women had given her. He caught Margaret's eye and something passed between them. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. They'd made it. They were safe. But safety, Margaret learned, didn't mean ease. The next weeks were the hardest physical work she'd ever done. Roof repair came first. Joseph and Swift Elk teaching her to split shingles while Black Wolf entertained Emma with stories. Her soft hands blistered. Her back ached, but she didn't complain. This was their home now. She'd make it sound. Garden work came next. The growing season was short at this altitude. Every day precious. Margaret learned from Apache women how to read the soil, which plants grew well together, how to preserve water. She learned from Mexican women to dry chilies and grind corn, to make tortillas on a hot stone. Emma thrived. Maria's school was a single room where children learned in 3 languages, older teaching younger. Emma soaked up knowledge like drought-stricken earth absorbs rain. She learned Apache words from her new friends, Spanish from Maria, mountain lore from everyone. "Mama, did you know bears sleep all winter, and eagles can see a mouse from the clouds? And if you whistle like this," she demonstrated, "the horses come?" Margaret treasured these enthusiastic reports. Her daughter was healing, growing, becoming part of this patchwork community in ways that would have been impossible in Millbrook's rigid structure. But the past wasn't done with them. One afternoon, as Margaret worked in the garden, she heard the sentinel's whistle, 3 sharp notes meaning strangers approached. Everyone moved with practiced efficiency. Weapons appeared. Children were gathered. Defensive positions taken. A small group of riders appeared at the valley entrance. White men, heavily armed. Margaret's blood chilled when she recognized the lead rider. Sheriff Watson from Millbrook, his deputy beside him, and 3 men she didn't know, bounty hunters by their look. Joseph materialized beside her. "Stay calm. They cannot enter without permission." The sheriff stopped at the invisible but understood boundary. "We're looking for a white woman and child," he called. "Kidnapped by savages. There's a reward." Grandfather Torres walked forward, several armed men flanking him. "No kidnapped women here, only free people. Don't play games, old man. We tracked them this far. Hand them over and we'll leave peaceful. You tracked onto Apache land," Torres said mildly. "Mexican land, grant before that. You have no authority here." Watson's face reddened. A white woman and child belong with their own kind, not living in sin with heathens. Margaret felt Joseph tense beside her, but before he could speak, she stepped forward. The sheriff's eyes widened in recognition. "Mrs. Sullivan, thank God. We've come to rescue you." "I need no rescue. Sheriff, I'm here by choice." "Ma'am, you're clearly under duress. Stockholm Syndrome, the doc calls it." "Come with us, and the only duress I suffered was in your town." Margaret's voice carried clearly. "Where you let a mob attack innocent people. Where Mary and Robert Crow died protecting us. Where being different was crime enough for violence." One of the bounty hunters spoke up. "There's a $1,000 reward. Her husband's family posted it. They want the child raised proper." $1,000. Margaret thought of Frederick Sullivan, washing his hands of them in person, but willing to pay to steal Emma for appearance's sake. The hypocrisy burned. "Emma," she called. Her daughter appeared from the schoolhouse, saw the riders, and pressed closer to Maria. "Tell these men where you want to live. Sweet pea." Emma's chin lifted. "Here, with Mama and Joseph and all my friends. You see?" Watson tried a different approach. "The child's been corrupted. Come back. Face a judge. Let the law decide." "Whose law?" This from Sarah, the escaped slave. "Law that says I'm property. Law that stole Apache land. Law that let mob burn the Crow house." More people gathered, surrounding Margaret and Emma. Apache warriors, Mexican farmers, white outcasts, former slaves, all standing together. The message was clear. To take Margaret and Emma, they'd have to go through everyone. Watson's hand twitched toward his gun, but his deputy grabbed his arm. "Tom, there's 30 guns on us, maybe more in the rocks. This ain't worth dying for." The bounty hunters were already backing their horses. They knew a losing proposition when they saw one. Watson's face twisted with frustration. "This ain't over. Decent folks won't stand for a white woman living in sin with savages. We'll be back with more men. Try it." Joseph spoke for the first time, his voice deadly quiet. "See what welcome you receive." The riders wheeled and left, spurring their horses harder than necessary. Margaret watched until they disappeared into the pass. then let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "Will they come back?" she asked Grandfather Torres. "Perhaps, but word will spread. Valley of the Lost, they call us, where Apache ghosts eat white men's souls." He chuckled. "Let them fear. Fear keeps us safe." That night, Margaret couldn't settle. She paced her small cabin, checking and rechecking the door bolt, starting at every sound. Emma slept peacefully, but Margaret saw those riders' faces, heard Watson's threats. A soft knock interrupted her spiral of worry. Joseph stood at her door, concern evident even in moonlight. "You are troubled." She let him in, grateful for the company. "They'll come back, with more men. Like he said, I've brought danger to everyone. Danger was always here. We are all hunted by someone." He moved to the fireplace, adding wood with economical movements. Apache by army, Mexicans by Texas Rangers, Sarah by slave catchers. You by those who fear different choices. "But I could leave, draw them away." "Where would you go?" She had no answer. Every direction led back to the same truth. There was nowhere in this wide frontier where a woman who'd chosen differently could live in peace. "Emma calls me Papa sometimes," Joseph said suddenly. "When she forgets, does this trouble you?" Margaret's throat tightened. "No, she needs a father, wants one, and you've been more father to her than blood kin who'd steal her for appearance." They sat in silence, watching flames dance, so much unspoken between them, held back by propriety, by fear, by the complicated weight of their different worlds. "In my culture," Joseph said finally, "a man who saves a woman's life is responsible for her always. But you owe me nothing." I said, "This is still true. Yet, he looked at her directly. "I find I am responsible anyway. Not from obligation, from choice." Margaret's heart hammered. "Joseph." "I do not ask anything. Only say truth. You and Emma have become necessary." The word hung between them, carrying more weight than poetry. Necessary. Like water. Like air. Like home. "You're necessary to us too," she whispered. He nodded once and rose. "Bar the door. Sleep. Tomorrow we make plans for defense. Watson was right about one thing. This is not over." After he left, Margaret sat by the dying fire thinking about necessity and choice, about the winding path that had led from a blizzard to this hidden valley. Outside, coyotes sang to the stars. Inside, Emma murmured in her sleep, safe for now. This wasn't over, but surrounded by people who'd chosen humanity over conformity, who'd built community from cast-offs and courage. Margaret felt ready for whatever came next. They'd faced storms before, natural and man-made. They'd face this one, too, together. Spring came to the hidden valley like a gentle awakening. Snow retreated up the mountainsides, revealing green shoots pushing through dark earth. The stream swelled with meltwater, singing its ancient song. Margaret stood in her doorway, watching Emma help Joseph plant the garden, and marveled at how much had changed since that desperate winter night. They had survived Watson's threats through unity and vigilance, but no attack came. Perhaps the sheriff had thought better of leading men into a mountain stronghold. Perhaps the bounty wasn't worth the risk. Or perhaps, as Grandfather Torres suggested with a knowing smile, the stories of the Valley of the Lost had grown in the telling until even hardened men thought twice. Margaret had changed too. Her hands were calloused now from real work, her aim with a rifle respectable, her knowledge of plants and preservation growing daily. But the biggest change was internal, the shedding of old fears, old restrictions, old ideas about what was proper or possible. "Mama, look!" Emma ran up, dirt smudging her face, holding seedlings carefully. "Joseph says these will be tomatoes. Can you imagine? Our own tomatoes!" The child had grown inches, brown and sturdy from outdoor life. She spoke 3 languages now, could track rabbit signs, knew which berries were safe. Most importantly, she laughed freely, unburdened by the judgment that had shadowed their lives in Millbrook. "That's wonderful. Sweet pea. Did you thank Joseph for teaching you?" "I'm teaching him too," Emma said proudly. He doesn't know all his letters, so I'm showing him. Maria said I could help with the little one's lessons. Margaret's heart swelled. Her daughter, bridging worlds with the natural ease of childhood. Behind Emma, Joseph approached, his face soft with the affection he no longer tried to hide. She is good teacher, he said, very patient. Yesterday she tell me my handwriting looks like chicken scratches. Emma giggled. It does, but it's getting better. As Emma ran back to the garden, Joseph lingered. These moments had become common, comfortable silences, shared glances, an easiness that spoke of deeper currents. Miguel returns from trading post with news, he said. Watson no longer sheriff, removed for corruption. New man does not care about old troubles. Relief washed through Margaret. Then we're truly safe? Safer, but also, he seemed to wrestle with words. If you wish to return to white settlements, would be possible now. Start fresh somewhere new. Margaret looked at him sharply. Are you trying to send us away? No. The word came quick, almost desperate. But you should have choice, real choice, not just fleeing from danger. She surveyed the valley, their small cabin with its now sound roof, the garden promising abundance, the school where Emma thrived, the community that had embraced them. Then she looked at Joseph, this man who'd saved them, taught them, waited with patience she was only beginning to understand. I choose this, she said firmly. We choose this. Unless you'd prefer we go. His hand found hers, work-roughened fingers interlacing. I would prefer you never go. It was the closest they'd come to speaking what had grown between them. Margaret's heart raced, but before she could respond, Maria called from the school. One of the children had fallen, needed tending. The moment passed, but the warmth remained. That evening, the community gathered for a celebration, the Apache New Year, marking the time of renewal. Drums echoed off mountain walls as dancers in traditional dress moved around the fire. Margaret sat with the other women, helping prepare feast foods, listening to their chatter in mixed languages. You and Soaring Eagle, Sarah said with a knowing smile. When will you speak truth to each other? Margaret blushed. I don't know what you mean. The women laughed. Child, everyone sees how you look at each other, like my Tom looked at me before he finally got courage to speak. It's complicated, Margaret protested. Different worlds, different ways. Every couple here is different worlds, Maria pointed out. Apache and Mexican, Negro and Irish, all finding way together. Love doesn't care about complications. Love, the word they'd all been dancing around. Margaret watched Joseph across the fire, teaching Emma and other children a traditional game. His face was animated, gentle, completely engaged. When he glanced up and caught her watching, his smile was like sunrise. After the feast, as children played and adults talked lazily around dying fires, Joseph approached. Walk with me? They strolled to the stream, moonlight turning water to molten silver. Nightbirds called, and somewhere a coyote sang to stars. The settlement sounds faded, leaving them in private world. Margaret, he began, then stopped, started again. My English fails for what I wish to say. Then say it however you can. He turned to face her, moonlight catching the planes of his face. Among my people, when a man wishes to court a woman, he brings horses to her family, shows he can provide, but you have no family here, and I think you would not want horses anyway. Despite tension, Margaret smiled. Probably not. So I offer what I have, protection, always, partnership in work and life. My heart, which you already hold. Emma is my daughter in all ways. He paused. And my respect for who you are, woman who stands against storm, speaks truth to power, chooses courage over comfort. Margaret's eyes burned with tears. Joseph, I know obstacles, different faiths, different customs. People outside would condemn. But here, in this valley, we make our own way. If you would have me. She thought of Thomas, her first love, father of her child. He would want her happy, want Emma protected and loved. He'd been a good man who would recognize goodness in another. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I would have you." His kiss was gentle, reverent, a seal on promises made under stars. When they drew apart, both were trembling. "There is more," he said. "Apache way and white way of marriage, both or either or something new we create. I leave to you to choose." "Both," Margaret said without hesitation. "We honor both our peoples, make something new from something old." They walked back hand in hand, finding the settlement still awake, celebratory mood continuing. When they appeared together, a cheer went up. "Finally," Sarah called. "We thought we'd grow old waiting." Emma ran to them, face bright with joy. "Are you getting married? Real married?" "If that's all right with you, sweet pea." Emma threw arms around Joseph's legs. "Yes, I already call you Papa in my head anyway." The wedding, when it came 2 weeks later, was unlike anything the frontier had seen. Maria's husband, who had some legal authority from old Mexican land grants, performed a civil ceremony. Grandfather Torres conducted Apache blessings. The Baptist preacher, who'd found refuge in the valley after defending a Chinese family, added Christian words. Margaret wore a dress sewn by all the women together. Apache beadwork, Mexican embroidery, American lace saved from someone's grandmother. Joseph wore his finest leathers and the one concession to white custom, a string tie Sarah's husband had contributed. Emma served as flower girl, ring bearer, an enthusiastic assistant to everyone. The rings were silver, crafted by the settlement's blacksmith from melted coins, inscribed with symbols from both cultures, as they spoke vows in English and Apache, promising to walk together through all seasons. Margaret thought of the journey that had brought them here. From a blizzard's desperation to this moment of joy, from the depths of prejudice to the heights of acceptance. "You are my home," she told Joseph in words everyone could understand. "You and this place and these people, we choose each other, again and again. No matter what storms come, you are my heart walking outside my body," he replied, translating an Apache endearment. "You and Emma, gifts from the winter wind." The celebration lasted well into night dancing, singing, foods from every culture represented in the valley. Children ran wild with joy. Adults toasted with everything from Apache Tiswin to Kentucky bourbon someone had saved for special occasions. Late that night in their cabin that was now truly home, Margaret and Joseph sat by the fire while Emma slept peacefully in her loft. Outside, spring wind played music in pine boughs. "No regrets?" Joseph asked. Margaret thought of the life she'd left behind, the constraints, the judgments, the narrow paths deemed acceptable. Then she looked at this man who'd become everything: protector, teacher, partner, love. Thought of Emma, flourishing like a desert flower after rain, of the community that proved different peoples could live in harmony when survival depended on cooperation rather than division. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Only gratitude." As spring moved toward summer, the valley bustled with life. Gardens grew lush. Children played in lengthening evenings. New babies were born to continue the mixing of bloodlines that made this place unique. Margaret learned she was pregnant, news that brought joy and a little fear. "Another bridge between worlds," Joseph said, hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Apache and white, raised with love for both." Word came occasionally from outside, the railroad pushing west, range wars between cattlemen and farmers, Indian wars grinding toward their tragic conclusion. But in the valley, they'd created something different. Not perfect. There were still conflicts, disagreements, the normal frictions of human life. But there was also respect, cooperation, the understanding that their differences made them stronger. One evening, as purple twilight painted the mountains, Margaret sat with Emma and Joseph on their porch, watching the community they'd helped build. Grandfather Torres was teaching a mixed group of children to make arrows. Sarah and her husband worked their forge together. Maria's school bell rang, calling students to evening lessons. "Tell the story again, Mama," Emma requested, "about the blizzard and how Papa found us." So Margaret told it, as she had many times, as she would tell the new baby and other children. A story of unexpected salvation, of kindness transcending boundaries, of love growing from the ashes of prejudice. And they lived happily ever after? Emma prompted at the end, though she was old enough now to know life was more complex than fairy tales. They lived, Margaret corrected gently, with happiness and sorrow, easy times and hard, but always together, always choosing each other and choosing hope. Joseph's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her close. Emma leaned against her other side. Inside her, new life grew. Around them, their chosen family went about the business of building something new from the scattered pieces of their various exile. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Nightbirds began their songs. Smoke from cooking fires rose like incense to the first stars. And in this hidden valley where outcasts had become family, where love was stronger than law, where different meant stronger rather than dangerous, Margaret Sullivan, who was now Margaret Soaring Eagle, knew she was finally, truly home. Sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the worst storms. Sometimes being lost is the only way to find where you truly belong. And sometimes, in the vast wilderness of the American frontier, the human heart finds ways to bridge any divide, creating from sorrow and separation something beautiful, lasting, and free. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. Where are you tuning in from today? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear from listeners around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Margaret and Joseph's journey. What touched your heart the most? Your comments help create our storytelling community.